So as you can see, the Arnold renderer, just before we even get into much, has just really, really superior quality. Let me show you what we can do to kind of ramp that up. First of all, we were taking a look at the trade-off of that superior quality is also inferior render times, or much higher render times. And we were playing inside of the render settings with these different sample ratings. This camera AA being the most important one, and I believe the other ones are like multipliers of this one in some way. So if you set these higher, you're actually like multiplying. I forget the exact math behind it. You can dig that deep if you'd like to, but typically you just need to kind of play with the settings and see what works with your scene in terms of render time. But there is another place to set sample settings. So I'm going to leave this as default for right now. In fact, I'll go ahead and re-render just to get an idea for how long it takes. I think it was only like 10 or 11 seconds at this default sample level. But the actual lights also have samples. So if we have multiple lights in the scene, we can, have a lot more going on in terms of, deciding what samples each light has. But in this, even with, okay, so it took 23 seconds with this default. But even just our default area light, we have, let's see, it's just these, we have these, there's two different samples levels, but what I'm really talking about is just this main samples right here. All right, so we could change some things. I'm gonna try just bringing the resolution up to, I'm gonna double the resolution, see if that makes any difference. I don't think it will, not much. I'll talk more about resolution when we actually do image-based lighting. I don't think that makes as much of a difference here. But what's important is that there's also samples for the individual lights, and we can also ramp this up. So let's be smart about it, and this is really the worst area in the image, right, is this middle right here on this torus. So let's just highlight that again. We'll get enough of it so we can kind of see without having to render all the rest of this. And we'll see how this works if we start stepping these samples up. Now, again, this is going to be some kind of a multiplier. So as you create these samples, it's going to, multiply against the global samples. But the understanding is that you can ramp this up a little higher without blowing up your render to a certain point. So it's kind of a happy medium to find. So let's just quad this and see what we get when we go to 4 on this. Okay, so that you can see, did you guys see the difference there? That was pretty significant. Were you able to see that? Let me put it back to 1. All right, so with the default, we've got all this noise right here, right? And then maybe I'll just go to 2 to see the difference there. Quite a bit of it gets taken away with 2. And if I ramp it all the way up to 4, still takes a minute to render, but that is significantly smoother. That I would be fine with the final render. You know what I mean? So now let's see what the difference is. It took like 20, something in the 20 seconds, like less than 30 seconds to render this at sample 1 with the default global samples. But now let's take the whole thing. And remember that we went from like 10, 11 seconds was the software render speed. But then when we did just the basic defaults on Arnold, it brought us up into like the 20s or 30 seconds. But when we upped the samples, that got us a much better view in just the globals, we were up to like a 4 or 5 minute render, right? It was close to 5 minutes, I think. So without having touched the defaults up here yet, and just ramping up the samples on the light, that may very well give us a path to be able to, like, it's still, you're always going to get better results with ramping up these, but maybe going up to 6 or 8, if I actually open it, see what I'm talking about, going up to 6 or 8 on this, and like, even just putting these at all 10s or something just to see what happened. I mean, yeah, you could sit there and watch your render thing go for weeks. Maybe try it on a tiny little spot. But the method is to start at the light level, right? I kind of wanted to show you the globals first to see how it worked in a general sense. I think it's a little confusing to throw it all out there together at once. But together, so this is still rendering. You see what we're getting here. We're almost there. You can see that this is so much smoother. I should have taken a snapshot. In fact, I'll take a snapshot of this one and then go set it back to 1 so you can see the difference in the whole thing. So that took 1:30. So that's 3 times longer than the 30 seconds it took without it. Here, let me snapshot this. You can see it takes a little picture of it down there. And I'll set these samples back to 1, let it render out. Should take less than 30 seconds. Maybe a little more this time. Seems to be taking longer than that, but anyway, we'll still compare the two, the rendering time and their quality. And this is such a big deal, as you'll see, when we actually dress up our scene and add realistic lights and materials and everything's looking awesome and moving around. You'll be real happy you understand the ins and outs of this Arnold rendering. Okay, so that took 38 seconds. I snapshot that one. Now we can compare the two. All right, so this was 38 seconds. You can see very noisy here. You can even see some noise here. Definitely lots of noise in the shadows. And then to get rid of that noise the first time with the globals, where I just opened this up and basically doubled these. So we set this to 6 and all those to 4. That got rid of the noise to some degree. It was actually still pretty noisy on certain levels if you looked close. But that brought us up to an almost 5-minute render. So leaving those default and ramping it up here took us, instead of 5 minutes, took us to only 1.5 minutes. And you can see that this is acceptable for a final quality render. Like these shadows look perfectly smooth. I'd have to get really, really close to notice a little bit of bounced light right here to show up more when we add materials. But for right now, that's significant. I would bet that probably if we were to, I think I have to render again. Once I'm clicking on the snapshots, I think I actually have to click the view render to see it. I just have to render it again. Oh, there we go. It's a little icon right here that you're either looking at the snapshots, or if you're looking at one, you click this icon again to get back to the render. It can be a little confusing when you're comparing. But when I'm back at the render, now I can take my little thing here and put it there. All right, so let's take a look at the outside lighting. But that's really, really important now that you can see that on the actual light itself in the attribute editor. In fact, let's blow this up to 8 just for this little spot right here, and I'll see if it cleaned up the cube where I was looking at it. A little bit, probably enough. If I were to do like a final like portfolio render, I might leave this at 8 and maybe knock those globals up also and get like a supreme render, but it might have my computer chugging on it for like 3 weeks to do like an animation of any significant size. So finding that happy medium, and in Arnold, it's about kind of leaving those defaults, even using the cropped kind of part of rendering window, the preview area, to render only parts of it, and then also to dial back the render globals when you want to do very quick stuff. But honestly, I mean, I guess you don't really need to dial them back too much, because anytime you make a change, like again, if I want to change the camera angle, or actually if I add another light, let's go ahead and just throw another area light in there. And while my render view is open, I can put it there and maybe dial it up a bit so we can actually see it, its intensity. Oh, because I still have the region. There we go. So I threw another light in there. Now all of a sudden we've got, you know, a whole nother aspect to bounce things around and calculate and everything. So having more lights in your scene will also increase the rendering time. That's also very important. Sometimes it's nice, especially indoor, if you want to have like a whole row of lights and all this stuff. It'll give you really interesting reflections and refractions, especially if you create meshes, you know, and make lights out of those. Those shapes are going to reflect on things. It's a really cool way to get environmental effects. But a lot of times you want to use as few lights as possible because of the rendering time. So let's open this up and add a couple of basic materials. I'm going to leave that second light just so that we now have something else going on. Great. Increase it a little bit just to kind of, no, I'm changing my mind. We're going to delete that light. We're going to keep our render time as low as we can, all right? But now let's go ahead and add a couple of materials to these, because you saw before when we were doing the software lighting, drag that to my other screen here, adding materials into these made it so you could just, there was a lot more interesting things going on the objects instead of just seeing how the light's falling on like the dull gray. So we will get to, there's a step between, we will get to adding different colors and materials, and there's some really, really cool things in there. But first, it's a nice lighting check to just use a standard material and not have any color or any materials or textures or anything yet, and just judge the lighting on that first. And that's something that we're going to do on all our models before we put anything in. So We're going to set that up here. There's one particular texture to use. All right, so we could open up the hypershade and create it this way. And this is a little different than the first time where I was right-clicking and doing assign new material. Well, if we want to open the hypershade, we can, and I'm going to click on Arnold down here, which should filter it. There's still a ton of Arnold materials. And again, like anything else in Maya, just like the modeling with their dozens of tools, you know, materials, textures, Arnold, all of this stuff goes so much deeper. But, you know, my intention is to show you the highlights and the quickest way to get the best results. And then, you know, if you want to learn and dig deeper, you know, by all means, it's awesome to jump into. What we have is, let's see in this list, standard surface. Okay, so this AI standard surface is the one that we want. There's all kinds of other things you can play with if you want, but what we want is I'm going to click this AI standard surface material in the hypershade, and it creates a new node for this material, and it shows what this material looks like on the shader ball. So it's very similar to the Lambert, which is the default material in the software renderer. So you can click that Lambert 1 and see that in the hypershade. And then if I click on the AI standard, this is like the basic standard one for Arnold, but notice just the default, if you click between the two, that how Lambert is extremely, like there's barely a highlight, there's barely a specular highlight on it. The standard shader is much more interesting. You've got a specular highlight, you've got these rounded kind of caustics, you got the stuff around the side. There's a lot of there's a subtle amount of reflectivity, and just without it being like a bright metal, but enough to kind of see the lighting effects. And that's what we want to juxtapose against here. So we create this, and I'm going to double, I can't name it in there. Oh, name it over here. So this side of the hypershade is kind of like, basically like the attribute editor. In fact, I'm not sure. I think they're the same. I don't think there's anything, I don't think one's a subset of the other. I think it's the same tools in both attribute editor and this portion of the thing. Now I'm going to show you more about all these tools. For now, don't mess around with the color or anything. We'll get to that next. First, I just want to show you the other lights with just this default material on all of your objects. So I'll just leave it this name, but just know that you can rename your material here. Or maybe I'll just call it basic matte, all right? So whatever, but you can name things. It's a good practice to get into, to name your materials, name your objects. Keeping track of things and starting to group them in hierarchies and groups and things goes a long way when you start to add a lot of detail. All right, so as we're in here, now that we've got our material created, from here, it's not actually connected to anything, all right? There's a couple different ways to do it from here. Now before, we'd already had a selection and we right-clicked it, whatever, and it was doing, going through the menu to just create, and opened up this little example part. Well, this is the whole material thing together. We've got all the material attributes, got all the initial material nodes to create, and then this is a list of all the individual materials, and each one will have what's called a shader graph. And as we start to get into textures, I'll show you how this works, but you can actually use the Alt key in your different keys to zoom and pan around on this as well. And a lot of hardcore texture artists and shader artists and material artists, they will work in this window all day long and just create nodes and attach things and make these very, very complicated shader networks. When we get into it, I'll show you like a complicated shader network that will have like 100 nodes, and you can get very, 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 very detailed. And that's how some of these insane looks that, you see in feature films and stuff that people spend a ton of time on, that's how they get there, is by going into all of this detail with the textures and the materials and the lighting. But for now, we don't have to worry about any of the shading network. We're just going to apply our basic materials. So you can apply a material in a couple ways from the hypershade. I believe the middle mouse button is one. I talked at the beginning about the middle mouse button and how there's all kinds of things in Maya that the middle mouse button does, because this was made and put together so long ago before really touch pads were a thing. So I have a stylus pen that I have one of the buttons styled as the middle mouse, but I'm pretty sure you can drag from middle mouse to an item and add the texture, which I believe it just did. As you can see, it has a little plus and it says basic matte, and I'm adding it that way, and I can see it add a little specular highlight, so I know that changed. So I can use my middle mouse button. If you don't have a middle mouse button, you can certainly just select your objects, where I could select them in the scene, or if I've got my hypershade in the way, and I know I just want to select my torus in my room, I can control select them, you know, like anything else. And the outliner over here. So really nice to have this open at all times, just to kind of select things, know what you're doing. And then you can right click a material, or actually, is it another right click? No, you can assign the material to a selection. I don't remember exactly where that is off the top of my head. Yay. Maybe you can't do it from this area. Well, regardless, you can very quickly and easily middle mouse drag, or once you've created it, you can go in and like we did before, you can right click and go assign existing material and choose it, right? So I chose basic matte. Now it's on that. And I'll do the same thing here. Right click, assign existing material, basic matte. Somewhere there's a way to select items and then assign a material to the selection, which is a way that I'll take a deeper look and look at it next time. It escapes me at the moment. But that's a way you can assign different materials to actual components of an object. So you could put different materials, different shaders on different faces of things. So before we go any further, just adding that standard surface material. I'm going to save my scene. And now I'm going to just re-render this and let this go all the way through. It should take less than a minute. Down here it says samples 11222222. That's the current level that it's at. It's going to finish. So this actually increased the rendering time quite a bit. But that's because this material, rather than the default Lambert one that was slapped on there, is actually like has all kinds of inputs to deal with the Arnold render. This is an Arnold specific material. It's meant to work with it. And I'll show you in a few minutes here how we can take this one material, apply it to every object, or at least a different copy of it to every object. And we can make all kinds of different objects and things. So this is, well, I'll just let it finish out at this point. I won't make us wait through too much of a render. Maybe I'll keep going. But you can get the gist of how this is going to be. It's probably going to end up being a 2 or 3 minute render. So already we're up there. So I'll probably want to dial back my stuff just to be able to kind of test and see how it goes. But it is nice that the way it progressively renders it, that you can still keep it like this and just work. And as you change things, watch it continuously do that. But let's see, is this still ramped up to like 8? Yeah, I'm going to bring these samples back down to 2 and see if that goes a little bit faster. All right, much, much faster. So now I got an idea to sit there and leave it at 8 while we're test rendering. You can see the difference. This is probably going to be done within a minute, where the other one was a few minutes. So as this goes, this is pretty much for the indoor, for the indoor lighting. Now notice, remember we have that square shaped light. We're actually seeing the reflection of the light itself. That's what this is. We get into image-based lighting, there's a lot more interesting things going on with the reflections and whatnot. But indoor lighting, we just create these lights, put them inside, move them around, and we can really recreate physically accurate rooms this way. But a lot of times in 3D, it's really cool to do some image-based stuff, or at least a sky dome light. I'm going to show you how that works real quickly. So you can even see this, the subtle reflections. There's just a lot more interesting, aspects going on in this scene. Even this, like I should smooth this torus. You can see the things on there. Actually smooth both of them. But anyway, I'm going to shut that for a moment. And I am indeed going to click the torus, hit the 3 key for smooth. Do the same thing in the sphere. So those should be perfectly smooth in the renders and not see those artifacts. I'm going to hit save on this. All right. So we had the basic lighting and then physical lighting. And now I'm going to let's create a new scene. Save scene as, and let's make this environment lighting. Okay. It's a little different. So those are 2 things so far. I went through the very, very fast. Now, as you guys can see, the software renderer doesn't approach the quality, but there's certain instances where being able to render things in 3 seconds instead of 3 minutes per frame could really save you. So it's really, really important to understand those basics and those tools at your disposal. But in general, we're going to do our darndest to use Arnold for our project because it looks so awesome. Now, this is indoor lighting, just creating these different types of physical lights, either typically an area light or out of a mesh. It's really, really common to use a mesh because you can size it, position it, even make it look like the lights you want to get different reflections and things like that. But the other real common way is to do environment lighting, which I'm going to bust back out here and use my perspective so I can kind of see my views around here. I'm going to get rid of my area light. And there's a couple different types of environment lights. The easiest and quickest, one of the coolest things to do is to add a physical sky. So I can click on this physical skylight, all right, and it's not actually showing up in my view. Let's see, if I render, is that gonna do? Surprised it's not showing up in the viewport, actually. Okay, so I see the colors. It is correct, but I'm inside the box. I'm gonna deal with this in a moment, but I'm gonna render just my perspective view so you can see outside the box. Perspective view, please. We have to close the renderer, go into just this view. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, and as I'll zoom out in this view, it'll update here, the physical sky actually creates a physical sky and a ground plane that not only is just in your environment now into infinity, but it will actually treat it as if, you know, you have some kind of light source out there. Whoops, I shouldn't be zooming in on that. Re-render that. Zooming in on this. And you can see that in this case, it's barely making it into this little closed box because the light source must be whatever, behind it, something like that. But let's go ahead and move this out of the way for now. Select our box, face, let's get rid of the top, all right? So now if I get rid of the top, now all of a sudden, let me actually go back into my camera view. So it really wants you to take it over for it updates. All right, back in the camera view, open this back up, there we go. So now, without even adjusting any of the brightness or anything like that, we're getting this pretty interesting outside lighting just by taking that. In fact, you know what, let me even, it looks like the light's coming from the left over here because this wall is all lit up. Let's go ahead and get rid of this wall too. Now it just brightened up a lot, all right? So I got rid of those two walls. I just kind of screw up my camera for a minute, I don't care. I zoom out, get away from it, and see that's now this little corner seam, but if I get in, get right in there, leave in position, whatever, you get the idea. I'll let that come back. In fact, I'll go back to my initial view by hitting that back bracket a couple times. See where my view was, I think this was it initially. And this gives us like a sunlight. And as this is, I'll let this block out for a moment here. Let's take a look, while that's happening, let's take a look in the attribute editor here. And we've got our intensity and our exposure as well. So we can certainly ramp this up quite a bit. This is on our actual dome light shape. Let's see, it gives us a skylight node. Let's stick to this for now. So the initial node, there's a couple of different nodes this gives us, right? So first we've got the light itself. You can see the quality this is coming out at. This is a real nice look. You can raise the intensity up, and that very quickly, without even touching the exposure. That makes it real bright out real quick. So in fact, I'll just put it at 2 instead of 1. And now all of a sudden, as it blocks out here, it very much looks like this could be like in the early morning or something. That we've got some shade and some shadows, but in the light spots, it's very bright. I'm sure the exposure, if I bring this up to 1, sure that'll blow it up real quickly. Now it's extremely bright, probably a little too much. I'll bring the intensity back down to 1. Well, we'll let it go out for a second before I do it. So a little too much, that's an extreme you want to watch out for when lighting, is what's being called kind of blown out or washed out white. When you get to the point like right here and right here, where you see that it just goes to pure white pixel on the screen, then you know you've got a little too much. So bringing up the intensity and the exposure, blew it up to too bright. If I bring the intensity back down to 1, so you can kind of play with in between those two. I'll go 1.5, some reasonable exposure. I think this gives me about as bright as I would want without it actually blowing out into pure white pixels on some of these parts. A little bit here, but that's actually pretty good. So very quickly, with the click of 1 button, you can add a sky dome light, and you can actually have the sky dome show up. Is it by default, actually? Whoops, I keep zooming out on that image instead of zooming out scene behind it. Bring this back up, zoom this out. I think by default, the sky is actually shown. You'd have to, yeah, it is, right? So we've got this brown plane, we've got this sky color. So you can very quickly get a nice, realistic outdoor light It's going to give you all kinds of great shadows and reflections and refractions. You can see, all this stuff just by slapping in a sky dome. Now, besides just the regular intensity and exposure to increase the brightness, temperature is something you can play with as well, is basically the color. So if we wanted to have like a more blue temp, or, I think this goes between blue and red, this temperature thing. I won't mess with it too much right now. The samples, again, just like before, you want to ramp these up to 4 or 8 when we're doing a more realistic render. Ramp those up before you ramp up the totals there. And most of this stuff is the same as what's in the other Maya or the other Arnold lights. But when we do the physical sky, it also adds this other node over here, this AI physical sky 1 node. All right, so the initial shape node is the same as most other Arnold lights. Really, those 3 things: the intensity, the exposure, and the samples are the 3 things you really want to worry about playing with it first. And then, of course, you can mess with temperature. So here, I'll turn that temperature back on. It's nice, like evening or early morning temperature. Like, you can get real basic with it. But the physical sky gives you like some controls over the actual physical sky. So these terms, this turbidity and ground albedo and elevation and azimuth and intensity, sky tint, sun tint, you can actually enable the sun to be visible or not be visible, change the sun size. So if I change the elevation here, I can make it very much morning or like, super, super late evening and have these completely different colors. Now, this is another reason that we want to do a light test like this before we get into doing materials and changing colors, because the light itself can really have an effect on what the colors look like and what the materials look like. So it's usually really important to get that kind of lighting set up with these basic materials first, and then you go add in details. So it's really interesting to see how I pulled that down. Instead of being up in the sky and having those nice shadows breaking across this, it's actually a slightly less interesting image, even though the color's a lot lower, because these shadows are nice and flat and the sun just coming from straight across. So all of these different things are actual. So, okay, there, we just got lucky and got the sun in view. So I got it down low enough and then moved the azimuth around. And now I've got it sitting behind this box. Now this is a very backlit. If I were to swing this around to the other side, we wouldn't see the sun in our view, but I could probably get it shining on, yeah, there we go. So now it's around the other side. So these are all very much like real-term physical terms that you can use to control the sun. And I tell you, there are a lot of situations where you just want some awesome, quick, physically correct lighting, and all you have to do is throw on a sky and move the sun around, adjust the time of day, and you can have your lighting taken care of in a heartbeat. And in the old days, before Arnold, having to get this kind of realism, these types of shadows and everything, would just be like a whole array of lights that are, causing all kinds of setup and development. So if I drag this elevation and go the other way with it, super high noon. And that's another massive advantage of using like one big outdoor light like this is, less lights in the scene, less rendering time. So again, this is, at high noon here, just with the temperature of the light, with the software render, we could like change it to a little bit yellow. I mean, that's really basic compared to what all this is doing. Oh, and I should mention this also. I just want to get a little closer so you can see how smooth and nice this looks. I'll let this at least get the middle of it going, and just compared to any kind of software renderer, obviously having everything smoothed. These don't even have a lot of reflection on it. We'll get to that, but you can see how the other shapes are like reflecting off of the bottom of this sphere, and it's subtle. It's very, very, very realistic. You can also, let's scroll out, see some of the environment. There we go. You can change the colors of these if you actually have this outdoor. Like if you have an outdoor scene and you just want, the sky and this ground to be in the distance, you can actually change the colors of them. So if I'm on an alien world and I want that to be the ground, and you can change the sky and the sun tint also, and change all these colors, which obviously, because everything is physical, it's going to affect the scene. So you can do a lot of very, very powerful things with just this little node, this AI physical sky node. After you've kind of got the intensity and everything set up, you can do some very powerful things to set up the mood and the type of lighting you want for your scene. So that is a really, really powerful tool. So then the next step, there's one more step besides actually adding materials. Well, I'm going over myself. Let's actually slap a couple of materials on here real quickly, because I think when we do the image-based lighting, the effects that it has will be more pronounced when we have a couple of materials. So, all right, I'm gonna back to my original view, release one that's closer. That's pretty good. Now I'm gonna hit undo a few times and get back to, all right, so this is a nice daytime. Maybe I'll move this elevation back a little bit so those shadows move back along the wall a little. Yeah, whatever. Doesn't need to be perfect. That's a little far, but typically, even at that first level, it's pretty easy. That's about where I want it to stop. There we go. Now we've got a nice shadow coming through partially. All right, that's a nice view to try this out on. All right, so what's awesome about this material, in fact, let's go back into, well, let's just do it from the viewport, actually. I'm gonna let this render on my other screen. But one thing to notice is that this photorealistic lighting is not showing up in the viewport. That's just because it's just not set up to do that. We can look at our objects if I hit 6, which will take the lighting off if you want a little easier job seeing them. 7 has the light on, but sometimes it's just not calculated in the scene itself. But anyway, what we want to do is we want to attach a separate AI standard surface material to each object. All right, so right now we have one attached to all of them. We're going to leave that one as the room shape. We're just going to leave this as that one. Now, for each of these others, I'm going to select my cube first. I'm going to assign new material and click on Arnold and choose the AI standard surface. And then I'm going to name it Cube Matte. I want you to do that for each of the other 2 objects. So you can leave the original AI standard surface on the room and make a cube matte, a sphere matte, and a torus matte. So by right-clicking, assign new material, filter it by Arnold, AI standard surface. Name it. All right, I have each of them named now. I'm going to open up my hypergraph to see the list of all of them now. And I can see that indeed I've got basic matte, which I'm going to rename from basic matte to room matte. So we start with this basic material on each item. Now, as this is rendering out, this is a pretty nice view here. We've got some really nice contours and shadows, and you can see how I kind of dragged the sun around until I found a good position. Right? I'm getting a really nice shadow up off of this corner. So I'd have to ramp up the samples to clean up the noise for a final render, but this is pretty good for a good visualization, knowing that if I were to set up a render to walk away from, this would be pretty good size. So let's see how long that took. A couple of minutes. So about 2 minutes. That's not too bad. It'd probably be 5-6 minutes if I up the samples a little bit to clean up that noise, but that's a nice looking room. I've got them all in here. They're 4 separate things. I can actually close this because I want to see my scene and I want to use the attribute editor to deal with it. So I'm going to select my cube and go over until I find my material node, which is on the far left. And I mean, you could do this inside of the hypershade. It's really the same thing. I just prefer to do it this way. But what we can do is there is a presets button up here. And this presets button is insane what you can do. There are a ton of different presets. So let's go ahead and choose gold. And there's also replace all selected, or you can blend these presets together. All right, so this one material can be all of these different types of things. I'm going to replace that with gold. All right, ooh, I accidentally had both of them selected. Oh no, I'm on the room material. So I accidentally turned the room into gold. I meant to turn the cube into gold, but screw it. We're just going to take a look at the room in gold. And maybe as this is happening, I'll work on some of the other ones. I'll let that render, but you can see as it's getting here, like the color from that room is like reflecting back onto these objects. You can see all the automatic reflection and refractions, and just like the shadows, the reflections and refractions are also like blurred out towards the edges, which is how it does it in realistic, realistic space. So now if I select my sphere, I go to a preset, Maybe we'll make this one balloon colored, replace that. Okay, that's red, it's a big red shiny balloon. Now we're gonna come to transparency in a moment. I just wanna throw some fancy colors and things on here. I'll select our cube. Oh, I can actually select the cube through the rendering viewport. I didn't know that was possible. Maybe I'm clicking through it. I'm probably clicking through it. Go to the cube material, set this preset. So let's try wax. Let's try something that's less shiny. Try wax. And then finally, on the torus, which you can already see before I add something to the torus. In fact, I'm going to leave the torus for now, just the standard surface material without actually changing it. We'll let this play out for a minute, but I wanted to show you how real quickly you can use this material and just get some insane rendering results with a wide variety of different materials. And again, these are materials: gold, balloon, wax. These are textures. We'll get to textures and UVs and wrapping things around and what we can do with that. But take a look at this gold box that just has these, it's incredible what you can get with this renderer without any real setup, just kind of using a single light and a single material on everything, and just set these presets to different things. And then you just play with the rendering time and the samples, and you can just get incredible results. If I were to make this not rounded, you would see the difference. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to waste the time right now. I'm going to let this go. So that rendered, you can see it's really bad over here as far as samples with the shining of this gold thing. But maybe I should real quickly take my room material and make it not so crazy. And maybe I'll make it a clay. And then I can change the color, make it this grayish color so I can get it back to a little normal, so you can tell what else is going on here. Now, as I let this render down a little further, you can see that the subtle colors from like this red balloon and this purple wax cube are actually being like reflected and diffracted and all these complicated terms onto the walls and onto the things around it. You'll also notice that as you add these materials and these fancy things, then it starts to become, the render time starts to blow up a little bit more. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to draw a box to at least save us some time. I'm going to draw a box about right here. And now I want to show you how to do transparency, because it's a little bit of a trick. It doesn't just happen automatically when you drag down the thing that makes it transparent. I'll show you what I mean by that. So I've got this going, and what I'm going to do is take this torus and I'm going to move it up. So it's actually like intersecting one and in front of the other for the camera view. It's actually intersecting both of them. Maybe I should move it in front this way a little bit. How does that look? That's pretty good. All right, so it's intersecting both of these. Pretty interesting. All right, and it's only rendering this spot, so it should go a little faster. But if I want to take this torus material and set its preset to something like glass, okay? So I set it to glass, and it's just going to look really weird at first. I'll let this render out. Hopefully it will only take a minute or so. So you can see this start to come together, and sure, maybe it's glass, but it looks pretty chaotic. It doesn't really work right at first. And the reason, and it could be because this is all like intersecting, I have it all in a crazy place, but it used to be at least that because it takes so much extra rendering time to handle transparency, like this looks more like it's chrome than transparent, right? Like you can't really see through it. You're just seeing all these weird reflections like it's a big chrome donut, right? Transparency, you have to actually manually set each object to say, okay, yes, it's okay to be transparent. You can't just set it on the material. So even though I set it to glass, which automatically increased to this transmission, which makes it more glass-like, I have to go open the torus, go to its shape node, and under Arnold, there is this check mark. Now this is really obscure, and it's really important to understand this part, because otherwise you may not understand why you can't get these glass-like effects or anything. But so I set this to glass, but it tells it specifically to be opaque, and that is the default. So for anything that I actually want to be transparent when I render it in Arnold, I have to uncheck opaque, and now it's actually going to be somewhat transparent. So that looks a little weird with that torus. Let me drag the torus back down, and I'll grab this balloon, go to the sphere material, and let's see, maybe I will tell it under its shape node, oops, there's its shape node under Arnold, I'll tell that not to be opaque, and then I will take its, why can't I change its transmission? Not sure why, because the metalness is all the way up. That's why. Okay, I'll turn some metalness down, turn the transmission up, and now I should see that this balloon is going to be semi-transparent. Should be able to see stuff behind it. But anyway, I digress. I'll come back to the rest of this, but I want to show you very quickly. So besides just setting up area lights, you can set up, and mesh lights, where you can just put wherever you want in your scene. Very, very quick and powerful to use a sunlight and just position it, and then to use this standard surface shader and use these presets to get all kinds of very, very interesting, photorealistic looks very, very quickly. So now there's one last step for lighting, and that is image-based lighting. I'm going to let this sit here and render, and for the moment, I'm going to open up my browser. I'm just going to open up Google here, and we want to search for HDRI images. Okay, HDRI stands for High Dynamic Range Images, and this is a step forward in computer lighting, or CGI lighting, is instead of using just like the math of a single light, like the physical sun bouncing all over the place, you can get these images that are created in a specific way. You can't just use any old image. They have like an extremely high exposure and have lots of levels and channels of detail in them. So let's go to hdrihaven.com, the first one that comes up. 100% free. Sweet. Where are they? Browse 200 plus HDRIs. Sweet. Okay, so we show you what they may look like on a sphere. So I'm going to download a couple of these. Let's take one that's outdoor, and let's go with this like park setting, I guess. Palermo Park. And let me download it. There we go. So what we're going to start with is we're going to just do the 2K version, because we're only rendering at a small level. We're not rendering at a super high level. Like, you can get insanely detailed with these, and higher detail, higher rendering times, but we're just gonna stick with the 2K ones for right now. So I'm gonna download that, and then let's go get an indoor one some way. Go indoor, and let's do this studio one. This should be pretty, or no, let's do this like city street, so to speak. I don't know. Let's do this. This is like a nice, fancy apartment on the ocean. I'd live there. Perfect. Download this. Okay. Now go back to Maya, and okay, this finally rendered. I'm not sure the transparency is showing up there. That may be because of the balloon thing. Not really worried about that. But let's go change to a different type of light. So I'm going to get rid of my sky dome light, and again, if I turn on the renderer, see nothing but black. But now I'm going to go in and create instead a sky dome light. Okay. And a sky dome light. Now, let's see. I'm going to add that. I think it's going to be a color map, I believe. So right now I threw the sky dome light in. If I go to render right away, it renders, but it's real flat. Okay, it's nothing like the physical skylight. Okay, this is rendering extremely flat. All right, because it's just basically one solid light coming from all directions around the entire sphere. So the point of doing this is using a HDRI image. So what I can do is in this color value, instead of just being this flat color, what it does, if I actually look at my 4-up view, just like the physical sky, it does indeed put a giant sphere around the entire scene, and it's lighting as if you're inside of this globe, right? And what I can do is select that sky dome light, and in the color value, you can click on this little create render node and choose a file. This is part of the way we'll be texturing. And in that file, next to the image name here, and I'm going to go to my downloads where this downloaded. Yes, access my downloads folder. Okay, here's my 2 options. So I'll start with this one, open it up, and you can see that by default, it actually throws the scene in there, right? So we are now in the middle of this thing, which is pretty cool. In fact, let me open this up. And this is like an environment texture. as well, that basically if we actually render this, we should see this in the background. So we could have this, being out a window or something like this. But in theory, I'm going to render it, okay? Now it's actually using all of these points of light on the image itself to render. So let me go back into my viewport. So as you can see in the render, you do see the image. There is a way to go turn it off so the image doesn't show if you don't want it there and you just want this. But let me go back real quickly, and I'm going to go back into my camera view. My camera view. I'm going to hit 6 so I can actually see my items. 5, 6. There we go. Oh, there. All right, now that I hit 7, all right, let's try this again. So 4, wireframe, 5, shaded view, 6 is shaded view with textures, which don't have any yet, and then 7 is the lit view. And this is actually showing the lighting in the viewport. So this is really powerful to very, very quickly see some of these effects on the lights. Now, you don't get the whole thing. You don't get it all bouncing around everything, but to basically be able to play with your model in this realm is really, really powerful. But what I want to do real quickly is grab this thing and make it a better material so we can actually see it. A torus isn't a very good material to make transparent because the curvature and having the inside, it's just very weird. We'll go to torus material, presets. Let's make this some car paint. In fact, I'm going to blend it. That's something I didn't really talk about. You can blend these together. So if I want half glass and half car paint, I could blend that. And now I've got this material that is half glass and half blend car paint, which is really interesting. And I'm going to bring this back up into the scene in general. And then maybe I'll undo those rotations to get back to, okay, so there's my scene. I don't see any of the walls. I can see that the shadows coming in here. I'm not seeing any of the environment. And if I go ahead and render this now, I guess I am seeing part of the environment there. I cut out my wall there. But we'll let this go through. We'll start to do from the middle out so we can see some of that. But much more so than just the physical sky, which gives us a really nice look, but using a high dynamic range image gives us a much more photorealistic look when it comes to reflections and things that are actually in the environment, because it really does treat from the lighting and what you see in the environment itself, you see what's actually in there. So as this gets to this next level and we start to see a little of this clear up, you can see how complicated that, like the tops of those trees are being reflected in this sphere. And you'll see the color also from the actual environment, and being able to put your objects in what is tantamount to a real physical environment based around that image just extremely quickly by setting up, again, just throw in a sky dome light, throw in an HDRI image, and slap the exact same, a copy of the exact same standard surface material on each object, and then go in and play with the presets. As long as you remember that transparency glitch where anything that you want to be transparent should have that opaque check mark unchecked on the actual object in its shape node. But not only those presets, but being able to blend between them in different percentages. You can look in more detail about how, if you want to go further than just the presets, you can start to learn about what these individual sliders do. And all those presets do is just move those sliders around. So every single one of these different types of materials, everything from, wax to just a regular matte material to this half glass, half car thing. Like, I'm not sure what I can see through and what I can't because it's not really in front of anything. I did actually make this a little more transparent. I think I am seeing through a little bit to the wall. But if you just look at the reflections and everything on the stuff that's reflective, it's photorealistic. It's insane. And it's very, very wild how quickly you can get there. Now, what's also wild is to see how big of a difference it is with different HDRI images. So let's go ahead and try the other one that was indoor. I'm going to go ahead and, does it let me snapshot halfway through? Yeah, cool. So let me snapshot halfway through this thing. Now I'm going to go back, select my light, go back into my map. Now, once I've added the color map here, instead of having a little checker box, we'll talk more about these little checker boxes and maps when we do texturing. But now it has this little node thing that you click on it and it just takes you to the node that has the image on it. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab the other one instead of this Palermo. Now Maya will automatically create this TX file. Don't know why, I just know it doesn't. And now I'll grab this other one, and as soon as it loads, now it started re-rendering the scene again, and it's completely different. The lighting is different, the reflections are different. I'll let it get to a certain level right around this point. In fact, maybe I'll even, well, I'll just let it go now, it's getting there. Let it get a couple in here so you can really see the difference between two different HDRI image. Oh, one other thing is when you have an HDRI image, it is extremely important that in the, is massive, massive important when it comes to just making sure you get rid of the noise and artifacts. Inside of your sky dome light, you need to set the resolution to be the resolution of your HDRI image. So we downloaded ours at 2K, so we need to put this resolution at 2000. If we would have tried the 64K, or whatever that super insane high one is, we would have to set that here too. And this will affect the rendering. So as you see, it started over. But that's just a little tip that I've learned playing with this over the years, that when you use an HDRI image, be sure to match the resolution of image to the resolution on the actual light node. And then from there, you can play with intensity. Now, usually you don't really play with intensity exposure as much with HDRI images. They just kind of work well as they are. But if you wanted to tweak things, you could. And then from there, you again would kind of ramp these samples up first before you might finally ramp the samples up in the main. But we'll let this block out for another minute or so to at least get a little more of this. And then I'll screenshot it and we'll compare between the two HDRI images. You can absolutely select sub parts like different faces and right click and assign a new material to just those faces. You can absolutely assign material to individual faces of a mesh. Well, I'll just let this finish. It's just about there so we can see the time on it. So this is still quite noisy. That took 3 minutes and 44 seconds, but we've got a physically realistic light and we've got our physical, you know, our shaders on here. So we're pretty realistic here. If I were to ramp this up to 4 or 8, it would probably take care of most of this noise. And now that you can model things, and again, you can see that the smoothing makes all the difference in the world when you go to render. And all these subtle little corners and things, it's just not gonna look right or realistic if you've got hard edges because of this photorealistic lighting. If I screenshot this, take a look between these two, that's a significant difference without changing anything but the actual image. So you can see not only the places where the shadows are completely different, obviously the reflections themselves completely different, and even the tone of the room.